A big change in world history occurred 500 years ago when Christopher Columbus discovered America. Now, let's put the word discover in quotation marks, because saying it was discovered is biased and misleading. In reality, America had been inhabited by humans for thousands of years. By the time that Columbus arrived, there were numerous cultures and civilizations in North and South America. So when we use the word discover, we must qualify it with discovered by Europeans. To complicate things, recent historical evidence demonstrate that the first Europeans to see North America arrived centuries before that. They were the Vikings from Scandinavia. There are also hypotheses that other groups from Asia and Polynesia arrived before Columbus. But let's focus on the events from 500 years ago because they have the most far-reaching effects. Christopher Columbus was from Genoa in present-day Italy, but his exploratory journey was funded by the Spanish crown. At the time, the crown had reconquered the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors, and it was embarking on a project of further expansion. Columbus was dispatched to find a sea route to the East Indies, present-day South and East Asia, to establish trade in spices and other goods, as well as serve to expand Spanish imperialist ambitions. Columbus did not find this sea route to the Indies, but instead came across the continents of the Western Hemisphere, North and South America. Generations of American schoolchildren have learned that Christopher Columbus was this great explorer. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We learned in school that Columbus heroically kicked off the development of the New World, implying that prior to the year 1492, America was devoid of civilization and basically a virgin land of wildlife and Indians. This was to become fertile ground in which to establish colonies and exploit resources and people. Columbus made 4 voyages across the Atlantic, landing in the Bahamas, the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, and the coast of present-day Central and South America. He thought he had landed in Asia, more specifically the East Indies, and thus referred to the Native Americans he came across as Indians, an erroneous name that survives to this day. The Columbus discovery indeed kicked off subsequent waves of Europeans who came to the New World searching for riches or simply a fresh start. Spanish conquistadors, such as Pizarro and Cortez, conquered the native civilizations and wiped out the power structure of the Inca and Aztec empires. Countless inhabitants were killed off either intentionally by violence and warfare or unintentionally due to introduced diseases. The stage was set for colonization by the Europeans. Their old world had been exploited to the max. Large game animals had been reduced, forests had been cut down, fisheries and river systems drastically changed, and large open tracts of farmland now dominated the landscape of Europe. The New World, by contrast, was a seemingly endless resource. The result of contact after 1492 is now known as the Columbian Exchange. Animals and plants were introduced to the New World, and new ones were brought back to Europe. There was also a cultural exchange and ideological exchange between the Old and New Worlds. Settlers from Europe came in large numbers, and slaves from Africa were introduced to replace native labor as the native population was severely reduced due to the introduced communicable diseases from which the Native Americans had no immunity. Likewise, diseases from the New World were brought back to Europe as part of this exchange. The first permanent colony was set up in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. When I was in grade school in Virginia, my history teacher proudly boasted that Jamestown was the first permanent colony because prior colonies of the 16th century ultimately failed for one reason or another. My middle school class even took a field trip to Jamestown, where we could see early colonial buildings and white people in period costumes speaking in 17th century English, much like Shakespeare, which we could understand with effort. Conspicuously absent were the African slaves. though today the tourist attraction makes efforts to correct this oversight by including the presence of slavery. Also absent from the tourist site in my childhood were the Native Americans. When I went back there as an adult, many years later, however, I discovered a new cast bronze statue of Pocahontas right in the middle of Jamestown, made more famous only a few years later, or a few years before, by the Hollywood animated movie of the same name, Pocahontas. In America, nothing teaches the masses like a good movie. However, you want to see movies. However, you want to see movies as accurate or inaccurate depictions of historical events, they sure make history interesting. Along this theme of first contact, I recommend Terrence Malick's visually beautiful 2000 film titled The New World for its portrayal of early English settlements as well as images of what Virginia may have looked like 400 years ago. Jamestown, and soon after Massachusetts Bay Colony, were the early settlements that later became the 13 British colonies that would eventually win their independence and become the United States. The period of American independence happened during the latter part of the 18th century, and every American schoolchild learns the date 1776 as the birth of the United States of America. This was perhaps America's first innovation, as the period of decolonization was set in motion. Subsequently, all over the world, former European colonies started to become independent, finally ending the colonial era by the mid-20th century.